Hi, I'm Diane McGarry with Drake at Arts. With me today are co-host Tom McGarry, author Jim Benn, and ASL interpreter Judy. Jim is best known for his Billy Boyle World War II mystery series. He found writing this mystery series brought him an immense amount of joy, enabling him to meet people from all over the country and the world, listening to their reactions, feedback, and most importantly, their own stories. Having grown up in Connecticut, Jim attended the University of Connecticut and received his Master of Library Science from Southern Connecticut State University. He's a member of the Mystery Writers of America and the Authors Guild. He has worked in the library and information technology fields for over 35 years and quit the day routine job in 2011 to write full time. Thank you for joining us. We'll step in right now as Jim is already talking.
Last gasp at uh, getting a literary agent. And finally, at really months after I had sent out 200 queries, somebody finally did take the series on. And it was picked up by Soho Press within months of that. So I was very lucky that I waited and was too stubborn to give up because
Yay!
things finally happened. Yeah, but it did take a while. And one of the reasons I didn't want to give up is that I had this notion that I could explore what happened during World War II through the eyes of this character. And Billy Boyle is, at the beginning of the series, is really looking for an easy way out. He's uh, recently made detective on the Boston Police Department, but that's entirely due to family connections. And all he wants to do is not get killed in the war and go back to being a cop.
Yeah.
His father and his uncle are both detectives, and they work up a plan to get him appointed to Colonel Eisenhower's staff at that time, who was a distant family relation. So that's the first point at which I brought in the fictional and the real and conjured up this notion of a relative of Colonel Eisenhower's. Um, and Billy gets appointed as an aide to Colonel Eisenhower without knowing he's about to become General Eisenhower and sent off to Great Britain to head up U.S. Army forces. So what that does is it puts him at the center of the war. So he becomes a military investigator for his uncle Ike. It's a distant relative, but he calls him uncle when they're alone together. Um, and it gives me the ability to send Billy anywhere because he's got General Eisenhower who can send him anywhere. And through the course of the series, we've looked at everything from how we dealt with the Vichy French and tried to win them over to working with the mafia in Sicily to invade Sicily, looking into the Holocaust and what people knew about it at that time, um, uh, how the Nazis and the IRA worked together in Northern Ireland to cause trouble for the British. And Billy is the character that observes all this for the reader. And that was the notion that really struck me as interesting, is that by placing him within the high command, I can illuminate little known stories of the war, and Billy is witness for the reader. Um, it's told in the first person through his point of view, uh, which provides a bit of a challenge because he's only seeing it through his eyes. He's experiencing the war directly. And I think that's one of the things that is a strength of the series, and that readers get to experience it with him in a way that they might not have seen in movies or history books. And the more I work on this series and the character, the more I'm struck that he's really a vessel for the reader to take a journey on with, to see areas of the conflict that we maybe glossed over or history glossed over. One of the books deals with segregation in the Army, and contrasting that with how the British felt about Blacks. They weren't necessarily welcoming to their own colonial Blacks, but they really didn't understand the style of segregation, the Deep South style of segregation that the Army practiced in England. So through all the books in the series, I've tried to look at things that maybe footnotes in history and dig a little deeper into them. So we've been to the Vatican and explored what the role of the Vatican was in relation to the Nazis and the Holocaust. There's been a lot of very heavy themes explored. And when I was looking for the subject of the 18th book, which is Proud Sorrows, that's out now, this one, it occurred to me that since the spring of 1942, and now it's late 1944, Billy and his cast of characters have only been on the go and in battles and investigating murderers. And seems like every month of that time period was filled with a lot of action. And I had neglected to ever give them a break and send them on leave. So I thought, well, maybe it's time for a bit of a different kind of mystery. So I decided to give them some leave and put them somewhere where they could encounter an unexpected murder and have more of a kind of a traditional mystery. And I had squirreled some ideas away over the years that I wanted to incorporate in the series. And one of them was something that just, for some odd reason, fascinated me. There's an American fighter plane, a P-38 fighter, that crashed on a training mission off the coast of Wales during the war. And it landed just off the beach in the water. The pilot got out, but the tides took the fighter into the sea. But even today, the sea gives it back, and it's located near the village of Harlech, and it's called the Maid of Harlech because every few years, this fighter plane appears. The tide brings it in, the sands wash away, and it's there for a few days, a few weeks, and then the tide brings it out and it disappears again. I always thought that was really kind of ghostly and strange, and I wanted to use that somehow. Then I looked at one of the characters, Diana Seaton, is Billy's love interest, and she's got a father who is involved in British intelligence, was an admiral in the First World War, and they have a place called Seaton Manor in Norfolk. And in the very first book, I had just looked at a map and picked out Norfolk for some reason. So I decided that they could all gather at Seaton Manor and have a nice bit of leave. And I thought, well, can I get this plane involved in that? And this all takes place, I don't know if this will show very well, but this map, that's not too bad. This is on the east coast of England, that's Norfolk, and that little notch of water that goes in is called the Wash. And it's a very narrow tidal basin, and the tides from the North Sea go in and out, and it was perfect for a plane to act like that. So in my fictional telling of it, it's a German bomber that crashed during the Blitz and appeared while Billy and all the cast of characters were enjoying their peaceful bit of leave. But what happens when they pull this thing out of the water is not only do they find some dead German crewmen inside, but there's the body of an English officer from the village of where Seaton Manor is located. And I do this to myself to give myself a challenge. I had no idea how I would explain that or how it happened. But it gives me something to focus on. And I always figured that if Billy has to solve these crimes, I do too. So I didn't know what the story would be, but I laid that challenge out for Billy and myself. Um, and Once I started putting the ideas together, putting a very rudimentary outline together, I realized that this was sort of like going to be an Agatha Christie style mystery for a change of pace. And even more so than Agatha Christie, I've always been a huge fan of Dorothy L. Sayers and the Lord Peter Wimsey mysteries. So if anybody enjoyed those, especially um, uh, the ones in Masterpiece Mystery in the 1970s, Ian Carmichael starred as Lord Peter Wimsey. Those were my favorite. So I looked around and found that actually Dorothy L. Sayers had lived in that very area, the same area, just a few villages away from where I had set Seton Manor. And one of her greatest works, The Nine Tailors, was set right there, in the same locale around the Wash. So then I was really excited, even if that didn't have anything to do with the story. I was writing a mystery set a golden age style in the backyard of Dorothy L. Sayers. But then, looking into this a little further, I discovered that Ian Carmichael, the actor who played Lord Peter Wimsey, served in the British Army in the Royal Tank Corps in World War II. What's interesting, just let me digress for a second. If you've read any of the books or saw any of the shows, Lord Peter Wimsey comes back from the trenches of the First World War, suffering from shell shock, and he launches himself into the gentleman's career as a detective to deal with his trauma. So in the very first book, he's in really, really bad shape. And Ian Carmichael, the fellow who plays him 30 years later, he was just the right age in the war in the 40s, as Wimsey was when he came, fictional Wimsey, when he came out of the trenches. And I just thought that was really interesting. And I managed to develop a part of the plot that would allow Captain Ian Carmichael to come into Seton Village and be part of the action. And I really had to resist writing him as Lord Peter, because he was I think a cobbler's son from the north of England. I mean, he was not a tough at all. So he comes on stage, and the wheels are set in motion to solve this crime, this mystery of what is the British officer doing in the airplane. And one of the little-known areas that I got to explore in this book is the role that German and Austrian Jews who fled Germany in the 30s, the role they played in the war. And both on the British side and on the American side, we used the language skills of German and Austrian Jews to in many different ways. And in this book, in prisoner interrogation, because the idea was a native German speaker would be able to pick up clues, befriend prisoners, not in every case, because they would often let them know that they were Jews and that they had the upper hand now. But they were called the Ritchie Boys. It was after Camp Ritchie in Maryland where they were trained. And there were over 2,000 of them that went through this program. And they had a very critical set of skills and methodologies. One was to never harm a prisoner, that physical violence was counterproductive, and they could get more out of befriending a prisoner, giving him favors, cigarettes and special food, and getting them to talk, because they would often match up. If the prisoner was from Dusseldorf, they would have somebody who had grown up in Dusseldorf, and they could talk about things that they had in common. It was a hugely successful program, top secret, because they didn't want the Germans to find out that the fellows if they were taken prisoner, that they would be interrogated in this pretty subtle way. While they didn't use physical harm, they used a lot of threats. They would do things like have a Russian uniform handy, and if a German who had knowledge that they needed refused to talk, they would have one of their men dress up in the Russian uniform, come into the interrogation room, and just stand there. And they'd say, okay, you don't want to talk to us, that's fine. And Comrade Kirov here will escort you out of the room and take you to Russia. Then all of a sudden, the Germans started talking. So that was one of the smart ways that they went about doing this. So in this book, in this very little peaceful village, not only is there a German bomber with a mysterious body in it, but there is an interrogation center in one of these great stately homes that the government took over. And they have high value prisoners there and a lot of these interrogators working with them. And the idea that Captain Carmichael is visiting in order to get some intelligence for an attack his unit is about to make in the Netherlands. Just to give you an idea what this guy did during the war, they had what they called flail tanks. And these were tanks that had a huge steel drum on the front of them with huge chains. And the drum would rotate, the chains would rotate, and they would explode mines ahead of them. So Captain Carmichael, Lord Peter in waiting, had the job of driving his tank at the rate of 1.5 miles an hour into the enemy guns, doing this flailing routine. So he had a pretty interesting war. The only injury he had was he lost the tip of a finger when a tank hatch fell on it. He didn't get his hand out of the way. And if you ever see a picture of Lord Peter, a publicity picture, he's always got his hand in his pocket. He didn't like to show his lost finger. So I want to come back to the theme of how German refugees helped the war effort in a little bit, but I thought what I would do right now is just read from the opening of Proud Sorrows and give you a sense of what this is all about. Now, I mentioned that these books are written in first person from Billy Boyle's point of view exclusively, but for this book, I wanted to begin a little differently. So this preface is from May of 1942, and it's not in Billy's mind. This is what happened 2 years before the events that Billy will encounter in the book. May 1942. It began as a glow in the night sky, a faint flicker barely visible in the swirling low clouds and pelting rain. Stephen Elliott saw it as he shut the door behind him and made for his automobile. Marston Hall sat on a hill with a commanding view of the valley and the flight path of the aircraft. Elliott shielded his eyes from the spitting rain and watched the flames on their descent, calculating exactly where metal would meet ground. In his surgery, John Bodkin heard the growl of the engine. Instinctively, he looked up as if to gauge the distance, but quickly returned to finish stitching a farmer's arm. A nasty cut, but clean enough. Agnes Day, who had received the message that her assistance was needed, risked a look skyward as she pedaled towards the doctor's surgery. The aircraft was close enough to make out the burning portside engine. German, probably. She shuddered, fearful of a sudden crash of bombs and death, of Germans in their midst, of torn bodies and shrieking men demanding care. She had had enough of that in London. Sir Richard Seton had been checking on the horses. As he shut the barn door, he followed the arc of light, little more than an indistinct glimmer from where he stood. Still, he knew it was dangerous. His eyes flitted across Seton Manor, looking for telltale lines of illumination at the edges of the blackout curtains. Nothing. Though the building was as dark and as quiet as the Norfolk countryside, worry gnawed at him. Inside the aircraft, a Henkel HE-111 bomber, flames shot sporadically into the cockpit as the pilot struggled with the controls. Screams pierced the air, louder even than the roar of the engines. The dorsal gunner was badly wounded. The 2 other gunners had patched him up as best they could before the pilot ordered them to bail out. The navigator was moaning, his head lolling as he held his belly. Wind whistled through the shattered canopy as the pilot tried to ignore the blood pooling in his boot. All he wanted was to find a patch of ground before it found him. They'd never make it back across the North Sea. A night landing in a storm was their only hope. On the ground below, there was no hint of the agonies they suffered. Alfred Bunch held the blackout curtain open for his wife, Mildred, as they left the pub. The wind nearly took his cap, and he pulled it tight as he cocked his head to find the source of the droning sound growing ever closer. Mildred pointed and asked if the light was a shooting star, but Alfred gauged it as something more sinister. They hurried, watching over their shoulders as the glow dropped lower and seemed to follow them. Father Noel Tanner, at his evening prayers, heard the crippled aircraft overhead. He sighed, said Amen, rose, and reached for his boots. The living and the dead might be in need of what comfort he could give. David Archer huddled at the foot of an oak, his hands pressed over his ears to shut out the blaring noise of death. It haunted him, even in the grove of trees perched on a hilltop overlooking the chalk cliffs and the sea. He came here at night for the quiet that had never settled over the blasted ground of no man's land in the last war. Now, his silent refuge was shattered. The burning aircraft dropped from the sky and drew his gaze as the space between hurtling metal and hard ground narrowed into nothingness. Archer pressed his face against the oak and rubbed his cheek on the rough bark, the warm blood soothing in the darkness. Throughout the village, eyes turned skyward at the sound. A child asked if she should make a wish, but was shushed and told to get back to bed. The war had come to Sleaford, and everyone who eyed the crippled bomber hoped it would keep on going, out to sea or back to Germany if need be, but away from here. Graham Cheatwood stood at his third-floor bedroom window. He watched Stephen Elliott stop and gaze at the sky, then drive away. He searched for what the man had been looking at and spotted it. A voice beckoned to him to come back to bed, but he knew that wasn't going to happen. He picked up the telephone and barked out an order. Then he threw on his uniform and watched the slow descent of the aircraft as it vanished behind a hilltop close to the cliffs above the sea. Then there was nothing but the motionless reflection of flames in the fog. So everybody you met there is obviously the suspects that we'll encounter later in the village, and Billy has to sort out who's who. And the plot is even thickened some more by the resurgence of British fascists. It was at this point in the war, in 1944, that a lot of the British fascists, Oswald Mosley and his British Union of Fascists and a couple of other groups were finally let out of prison because there was a thought that they couldn't do any more harm because the Germans weren't going to be invading. But they got up to a lot of trouble, nevertheless. So one of the things that fascinated me was the contrast between the German refugees who left their country and worked as hard as they could to defeat it, and the homegrown British who had everything and were willing to give it up for a fascist future for Great Britain. So there's a little bit of compare and contrast going on there. One of the things that I mentioned was the role that German refugees, Jewish and non-Jewish, played in the war effort. And this has been brought up before. The Red Horse is a book that finds Billy in an insane asylum, basically recovering from amphetamine addiction and combat fatigue. And part of the plot there revolves around how badly the British used anti-Nazi Germans during the war. They recruited from prisoners of war soldiers who claimed to be anti-Nazi, and they went through a program of validating that and asked them to volunteer to parachute back into Germany to make contact with other groups working in the anti-Nazi resistance. They sent them, dropped them in with contact information, the whole time knowing that there were no such groups. that these men had volunteered, not knowing that they were being sent to certain capture, torture, and death. The idea being that they wanted the Germans to think there was a more active resistance. So they gave them contacts. Who knows what happened to those people? They were just names drawn out of a hat. Um, so the British were pretty hardcore when it came to doing what had to be done. But um, anyway, as you might guess, somebody involved in that might want some revenge. So that's part of that plot. Um, the book I'm working on right now, which is not for next year, but the year after, um, it really came about because somehow I stumbled across the fact that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's daughter, Jean Conan Doyle, was an intelligence officer with the RAF in World War II, and she was working on electronic countermeasures and electronic eavesdropping. So that blew me away because there's another connection to the golden age of mysteries. We've got Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's daughter. So she's part of the story that I'm working on. And um, again, I encountered the German refugees, the Jewish refugees that came out, men and women, and ended up working in this area in an early form of electronic warfare. So what Jean Conan Doyle's job was, she oversaw um, women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and the RAF, and they would eavesdrop on German communications, intercept them, take down the Morse code, sometimes getting direct and clear transmissions, not only translating them, but often spoofing them. So they would then send out, using their native German speaking skills, send out false messages. And they did this a lot during bombing raids. So the German controllers on the ground would be sending up directions to their night fighters to go after the RF bombers, and they would then break in and countermand those orders. It was a very much a cat and mouse game, and at times the different operators came to know each other and recognize the voices, and would engage in almost banter, but saying, no, that's the false, that's the Englander. No, I'm the German, you're the Englander. So it was a pretty interesting group of people. And also the men ended up flying in the Lancaster bombers, and doing the same thing, jamming German radio frequencies, giving out false directions to the night fighters that were coming after the bombers. And their squadron had the highest casualty rate in the war because one of the things, and if anybody happens to be watching Masters of the Air, this is brought forward. You had radio silence because the more you talked to other ships, the more the Germans could hone in on you. And what these were extra crewmen in each bomber, and all they did was send out radio messages, either to block the radar that the Germans had or to spoof and give false directions. But it meant that every German fighter in the area could see their radar lighting up and go after them. They were called Jonahs by the rest of the crew. And I mean, it wasn't their fault that they drew all this fire. It was part of the job, but it seemed like they were all kept apart somewhat from the regular crews because of what everybody knew that they were bringing. They were protecting hundreds of bombers, but they were bringing fire on their own. So I thought that was interesting, and that's part of what we'll be exploring in that book. But for this coming September, I'll just do a little promo. I have to say that Soho Press does such a super job with the artwork. This is the inspiration for this was taken from a photo, a pretty well-known photo of an American GI during the Battle of the Bulge, advancing cautiously out of the woods, just like here. But what they did with this, I just get cold looking at this. The snow, it's masterful. The lighting, the depth. So I'm really very happy with this. And I'm just going to read if we're not pressed for time, I'm just going to read a touch from the first chapter and stop when I get to a famous name and talk about some of the real life people that are in this book. So this starts on December 13th, 1944 in Paris. The night was cold, cloaked in a deep darkness brought on by a bank of clouds sailing in on the winds and vanquishing the moonlight. Dead leaves, crisp and brittle, swirled in man-sized cyclones on the cobblestones, one so dense that I mistook it for someone sauntering through the graveyard. But no one was strolling through the Père Lachaise at this hour. I knew that for a fact, having been here lying in wait for the last 5 hours, standing in wait, as a matter of fact, with only Marcel Proust for company. He didn't have much to say, being 6 feet under. I had a small cemetery chapel to lean against, but that didn't stop my legs from cramping up, and not for the first time. I sat on Marcel's cold tombstone, offering up my apologies for the disrespect. I heard a crunching sound, maybe leaves being crushed underfoot, or the wind, sending leaves skittering against a wall. Scritch. The sound drew nearer. I squinted, trying to locate where the noise came from. Somewhere along the path, close to where Kaz was hiding. I couldn't see him, but we'd been through enough that I trusted he was right where he needed to be. I spotted it, a large leaf, its curled lobes arched downward, its stem pointing upward like the tail of some gruesome insect dancing down the cobblestones. I almost laughed, spooked by a dead leaf. I checked the luminous dial on my watch, a little past 4 in the morning. We'd expected them at 1 o'clock, or 0100, the way the Army liked to say it. I began to think about giving the whole thing up, blame it on bad intelligence, but it seemed to me that the Syndicate du Renard was not coming out tonight. I thought about slinking back through the tombstones and monuments to where Kaz was hidden near the grave of Oscar Wilde. The Père Lachaise Cemetery, all 80 acres of it, was a ritzy final resting place for the rich and famous, as well as regular Parisians who were lucky enough to get in. We were here with a team of counterintelligence corps agents, waiting for a gang that aimed to do a little grave robbing, or so we've been told. I stretched, trying not to stiffen up. I moved around the tiny chapel, waiting for any sign of movement before I headed in Kaz's direction. Then I heard the footsteps, the fall of a boot heel on gravel. Silence. I froze, listening for another sound. It was impossible to see any distance through the crowded grave markers, crypts, and mausoleums, but from what I could make out, the light and sound had come from behind me, deep within the cemetery. Had they already gotten in? We had the entrances covered. 2 CIC agents were at the Rue des Rondeaux gate, 30 yards in the other direction. Our source said they'd use that entrance, but I guess his dope didn't extend to their arrival time. I took off a glove and unholstered my Colt, stepping over graves and catching the slightest of sounds, probably much like the noise I was making. I stopped beside a tree about halfway to Kaz's location. I edged around the trunk and saw a mausoleum not 6 feet in front of me. The thick wooden door was open. They'd been inside the cemetery all night before we got there. Patient bastards. I heard the clink of metal on wood, the sound of tools being carried. I followed the sound, which was headed for Kaz's position. There was no way our guys outside, or even the 2 agents at the gate, had heard, but I could only hope Kaz had picked up on the clatter. The wind kicked up, swirling leaves again and making enough noise for me to barrel around a couple of tombs and make my way to the path. That's when I saw them. 4 guys gathered around a flat gravestone. They were blurs, the darkness too complete to make an identification, which is why we had CIC Special Agent Jerome Salinger with us. Then I'm just going to stop there. Does anybody know who Special Agent Jerome Salinger is? J.D. Salinger. So J.D. Salinger was in the counterintelligence corps. He landed at Utah Beach on D-Day, went through some pretty heavy battles, ended up being present at the liberation of concentration camps. Now, the CIC agents were not necessarily frontline combat troops. but they provided security. They would question people coming into the battle area. They would detain people necessary. They also did black market investigations. And in this case, Special Agent Salinger is working with Billy Boyle on a black market operation. But what I found just, it really blew me away. J.D. Salinger's World War II record informed all of his work, and I never knew that.
Wow.
If you, one of his short stories, A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, I recommend you read it. I'm not going to say anything about it, but read that, and then you'll understand what he went through.
Oh,
And now, whenever I look at any of his work, I see the war in it. It's like, how did I not see this before? Well, mostly because he didn't talk too much about it. He was pretty messed up. He checked himself in Germany after the war was over into a hospital for nervous breakdown, combat fatigue, or whatever. And I wrote a lot about wondering what it would be like to put a bullet through his hand. Anyway, but
wow. That's
but
just amazing. I mean, we don't know the background of a lot of authors for certain
right,
images, right? And
yeah,
but of course, your history colors everything you bring
yeah,
forward.
yeah. Um,
Lois had a question for you too on a different line. She wanted to know, while you were doing the research with the Ritchie boys, whether you got to talk to them.
no, sadly not. By the time I did, there were very few left, and there was one fellow who just recently died, who his name escapes me at the moment, but he was still active in his 90s, speaking mostly to schools about what they did. But no, that would have been an honor, but no, I wasn't able to.
Yeah. You just have done so much incredible pieces on this and such incredible research everywhere. It's amazing. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you, thank you. So I'm excited about the Phantom Patrol, and I just have to mention one other real life person who's in it who almost stole the show, and that's David Niven. So David Niven, when the war broke out, he had made it in Hollywood. He made it to Hollywood. He had been in the British Army, tried to make a go of it, got in a lot of trouble, and ended up taking on acting, and then went to Los Angeles and Hollywood and got himself a contract and was starring in films. And the British government asked all the British actors in Hollywood to stay there, not to return to Great Britain, because they wanted them to work on not propaganda, but showing the flag, that sort of thing. And he just went back. He went back and immediately and joined up and was trained as a commando. Was ended up being working in intelligence on General Montgomery's staff. And again, if you've ever read any of his, he wrote two autobiographies, The Moon's a Balloon and some other one. And you can look up old clips of him on talk shows telling stories. He's a great storyteller, but when it comes to the war, he skirted around a whole lot. So that informed a lot of his life as well. But he's just, I mean, I'll just sum up with, during the Battle of the Bulge, most people know there were Germans infiltrating in American uniforms. So there were a lot of passwords and questions about, who did Babe Ruth play for and all that stuff like that. And he famously said at a checkpoint, well, old chap, I don't know the password, but I did star with Betty Grable in Bachelor Mother. So there were a lot of lines I couldn't resist putting in. So he was a lot of fun to write with. So that's where we are. I'm working on the 20th book right now, and that ought to be ready for next year. And we'll see where that takes us.
How long does it typically take you to write a book? Is there anything typical?
Well, given that my publisher wants one a year and turns
Oh my gosh.
it takes a year.
Okay.
But that includes the research for the next book. So right now, I'm finishing up the book that I'll be submitting this summer. I'm preparing for the outline to put forward to Soho Press for the contract for the next book that I'll start on. And then I'll be doing the publicity for the Phantom Patrol. So usually around September, I have no idea what book I'm talking about because there's three that I'm juggling, and I hardly remember the one that I'm supposed to be talking about because I'm 2 books away from that already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not complaining.
No, I get it. I get it. It's just a matter of balancing and scheduling your life.
Yep.
So you're
Yep.
working on A while you're talking about B and you're promoting C.
Yes, exactly. Right.
That could be really confusing.
Well, yep, it does happen. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking we're going to go to Cuba because I found out that Cuba was a strong ally of ours during World War II, one of the first Central American states to declare war on Germany. And you probably have heard of the St. Louis, the ship that before the war started left Europe filled with Jewish refugees, and they were supposed to land in Cuba. When they got there, most of them were sent away for a number of reasons. That there had been some anti-Semitic energy in Cuba that kind of worked against them, but also because the head of immigration in Cuba sold about 90% of the people on that boat fraudulent passes. So he sold them for about $500 a piece, which was a lot of money back then.
Yeah.
And when they landed, about 90% of them, the papers were no good, so they couldn't even get off the ship. But about 20, 25 had full papers, good papers to get off, and did leave the ship. So I'm kind of exploring that. And then we've got the Duke and Duchess of Windsor just up the Caribbean a little bit, sitting in Bermuda, trying to figure out how to ingratiate themselves with somebody. So anybody.
Oh gosh. There's a lot that revolves around these war stories that we don't really think about, and how, in some instances, how we even got to a place to have these wars in the first place. And then how do we get out of them? And of course, no one wants to have another one. So how do we stop all these questions? How did we get there? How did we get here? And how do we prepare for the future? Those questions are always brought forward.
Right. And how can we learn? What can we learn from it? Just
Right.
hopefully something.
Yeah. What have you learned from doing these books? Speaking of learning.
Well, I think through reading a lot of stories, the thing that I've learned is that you can't ever know what you would do. That, so many of the people that emerged as heroes, just you never would have imagined they would have done anything like that. And some of the more bombastic among us that back then failed in certain ways. So I think, first of all, I've learned to be thankful that I don't live in a war-torn country, because when you see pictures and you think of it just as a moment in time, but that was their whole life. It wasn't just they were bombed out one night. They didn't have a place to live for months or years. So I think that the totality of what happened to so many people is, I think we tend to forget that in viewing these, just reading a book or watching a movie, and then you leave. It's so much more than that. If that makes any sense.
Oh, that makes incredible sense. And it's interesting you said that a lot of people would talk around their war experience, right, without going into it.
Absolutely. I had it hasn't happened much. It hasn't happened at all in the past few years, but I did get to talk to a number of veterans earlier on, and it was always the case that the people that they were closest to, they didn't tell anything to. But somehow they felt that they could, by talking to me, they'd be helping me, so they would share their stories. And some of the things I heard was the first time they had been said ever. So,
How does one heal then? They don't talk about these things.
Well, that's a good question. They try to forget them. I don't know. But I've seen once I was in a hospital room visiting somebody else, and the fellow in the next bed was a veteran, and we all started talking. And he had been with the airborne in the Normandy invasion on D-Day. And he told a lot of funny stories. And after a point, when it was just he and I talking, and the other people in the room were talking together over by the window, he motioned me to come closer, and he said, they always ask me if I killed anyone, and I tell them I didn't, but I did. So that guy, that was 60 years after the war, and that was probably the first time he ever said that. So, really good question. I don't know how. And I think that's one thing, it's a lot of fun writing these books, but I hope in every one there's some point where somebody reads something and can connect to the experience that I'm trying to describe and get a feel for, again, not what it was like for my main character, because he's the vehicle. He's the empathy machine to move people into an understanding of what this or that might have been like. And if that can happen once in a book, then that's a plus.
Mhm. But in a way, you also talk about the healing that can come from talking about this. There's such a cultural stigma about talking about, or even killing someone, right? If someone's in war, 99% of them are going to be killing somebody. They can't help it. That's what warriors do. So to be afraid to tell people who cared so deeply about you that,
there was a lot of self-censorship. A lot of the letters home really disguised how bad it was, because they couldn't. How could you tell your loved ones the horror of what you were seeing every day, especially on the front lines or in the air? But I think that was important. And I recently read Paul Fussell is a great author. Was an infantry officer in Europe. And later became a philosopher and a writer, and he wrote The Great War and Modern Memory about poetry in World War I. But he also wrote several books about World War II and was very critical of even war correspondents like Ernie Pyle for romanticizing death. And a lot of the pieces that Ernie Pyle wrote and became famous for, he thought were crap because it didn't tell the real story.
So somebody asks, could you also describe guilt and survival guilt felt by Diane Seaton, which thrust her into many of these adventures?
Yeah. So Diana Seaton, as I said, is Billy's love interest. He meets her in the first book. And she had been part of the first aid yeoman nurser. I'm putting the order wrong. First aid nursing yeomanry, which was a group of women volunteers who went with the British Expeditionary Force in the first part of the war to serve as switchboard operators, drivers, behind the lines kind of stuff. But as the Germans swept through and sent the British scurrying off to Dunkirk, everything was mixed up. There were no rear areas, and Diana was put on a destroyer at Dunkirk with a lot of wounded on board. The destroyer was sunk, and she witnessed wounded on stretchers sliding into the water and drowning. She survived, which led her then to volunteer for the Special Operations Executive and go on a number of highly dangerous missions. Part of that, now Billy is telling us this. This is his viewpoint, that this is survivor's guilt. She can't stop doing this because she remembers what it was like surviving when all those around her died. It's interesting now at this point in my chronology of the war that there's less and less for the SOE to do because there's less and less of occupied Europe. So I think she may finally have a reprieve here, and but we'll see. We'll see.
So your characters create their story as you go along.
They often do. a lot of times if I'm feeling like I don't know what's going to happen next, I just thrust them into the next situation and uh, and and force an obstacle on them that they have to overcome, and that will reveal something about them because I try to keep the characters true to themselves throughout the books, or true to the way the war changes them. But definitely, yeah.
Lois wonders if you've thought about having a movie made based on
Oh,
your.
I think about that all the time.
Uh,
I was
So,
thinking as I read that it's not necessarily the author's choice to have.
yeah, that would be quite welcome. As a matter of fact, there are some uh, discussions going on with a producer who is putting that notion forward, not for a movie, but for a series, because pretty soon there'll be 20 books out there. So there's a lot of content.
Well, how do you pick, right? Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll see if that happens. But right in the very beginning, um, even before the first book was published, Leonardo DiCaprio's production company got in touch with us and said, is this available? And then, see, this has happened a few times, and people connected with Hollywood get all excited right away, and they have to have everything immediately, and then you never hear from them. Finally, DiCaprio's company got back and said, well, Leonardo decided on a darker project. So that's when a year later, The Departed came out. So that was pretty dark. But this, I'm not holding out any hopes, but what's going on right now is the farthest we've gotten up the food chain to talk to people. So,
Well, we all are very excited and hope that you get all the way up the food chain.
yeah, and not get eaten.
That would be wonderful. Yeah. Tom, did you have any questions?
But I just note that when you have a long series, I suspect, I don't write myself, so I'm not sure how true this is. So you probably have an opinion. But when you write a long series, I think there's a danger of it easily becoming formulaic. But because you research all these real life situations and events and people, many of which at least are surprising to me, that you don't seem to do that. It's very realistic because it's partly based on real people. So anyway, do you have a comment or an opinion about that?
Well, thank you. And one of the things I tried to, early on, I realized that, and early on, I mean, after the first book, and I was going to start the second, that this can't be Hogan's Heroes. That, Billy is pretty flip and says some funny things that I wish I could come up with without having to think a half hour about it. But I really was cautious about not being too simplistic. And what I've tried to do is modulate each book so that it's somewhat different. There are a few books that kind of went in order, and there was a series set in France. There was 2 or 3 books were pretty connected. But like giving them leave and putting them in an English village was a different kind of experience. And that freshens it up for me as the writer as well as for the reader. Getting characters like J.D. Salinger or David Niven and making them part of the story, that just makes it vibrant in a way that they're only going to be there because historically they would have been during that time and in that place. The idea of going to Cuba and the Bahamas, that's a little off the wall, but that'll, again, that will be something different.
I think that's great. Well, because you keep on putting in freshness.
Yes, yeah. And then we might have to go to Cuba and the Bahamas to do some research.
Oh boy.
Twist your arm on that one, right?
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. This has been, it's just really been fascinating. And thank you everyone for coming to March Arts Saturday. We really appreciate your being here. If you'd like to get his books, please go to our bookstore. That's, where is the address? It's bookshop.org/shop/Drake Arts. And we'd also like to thank our many sponsors for making these programs possible. Please let them know that you appreciate this. Consider becoming a sponsor yourself. You can do that by emailing us at drakeatarts@gmail.com or go to our website, drakeatarts.com/donate. To receive more information about the Drake Arts programs, our interviews, and our special events, please go to our website. Again, that's draketarts.com, or email us at draketarts@gmail.com. This and all our programs are archived on the Drake It Arts YouTube channel, and I've probably said this all too fast for our wonderful ASL interpreter there. It's youtube.com/@Drake It Arts. Thank you all so much for coming today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.